Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Take a minute, like the video. Please, most importantly, share it with folks. Get this out in front of folks. Let people know we're having this conversation right now. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Support us on Patreon. And if you I just added this to the show description this morning too. There's a link to support the Samir project. It's just really important, I think, to continue to do whatever we can, monetarily. There is still some food in Gaza amid what are famine conditions, and it's expensive for people to buy. And so anything that you can do to help people with that, knowing that they can't work because the whole society has been freaking destroyed, right? And so just wanted to say that up front. Also, obviously, this has been a really tough couple weeks, and I know that we will talk about that. But there's a lot that we have to talk about on the heels of the last couple of days in particular. But I just want to center everybody, that this is this is about Palestine. This is about Gaza, and we're gonna, I know, talk about some things within the U.S. context today because I think it's important to talk about them, and they're not disconnected as just, oh, this is happening in the United States. It has nothing to do with Palestine or Gaza, but I think it's really important that people also stay focused on, a siege that's 3 months long, denying all food. We'll talk about the aid kind of propaganda psyop stuff that's going on right now. There's really not any aid getting into Gaza that is even close to meeting any kind of needs, and even a lot of it is not getting in at all, even what's being said to go in. So we'll talk about all those things. um my guest, Lara Sheehi. Actually, we may need to update her bio, but she is a scholar of clinical psychology, a doctorate in psychology. She is the co-author of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, along with Stephen Sheehi. And, this book won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. And she is also the author of the forthcoming book, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, which will be coming out next year on Pluto Press. Lara, welcome back. This is our 14th conversation, I believe, in this series, although sometimes my counting skills are not very good. But yeah, good to be with you.
Good to be with you.
Always wish it was under different circumstances, but I'm happy to be with you anyway. So anyway, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Back in the settler colony. So,
In the settler colony.
and back to some big action. So
Yeah, so let's just start there. I mean, it's obviously going to be what I think everybody probably wants to hear us talk about. It's what I think is on both of our minds a lot,
yeah.
which is there was this action alleged to have been taken by Elias Rodriguez, I believe is the name. And, this led to, so two people were killed as a result of this action. One of them was a German Israeli Christian IDF veteran of the IDF. And I actually don't know too much about the woman who was his partner to be, but they both worked in different capacities for the the United for Israel, and this action took place. Is it inside the embassy where this, or on the embassy grounds? Because it was at a museum, right?
Museum, yeah. I'm not clear how the proximity of it
Yeah.
either. But it was an event, I think.
Yeah, right. It was an embassy event. And so anyways, this has led to a flurry of discourse and condemnation by a lot of organizations in particular. And Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't put too much thought into where, we
Oh, yeah.
want to start the conversation, but one thing that I actually will show to start us off was a little comment, I saw from Susan Abu-Hawa, which
Mhm.
I thought, was a good place. So let me pull that up really quickly. Um, all right. Why is this not working? Do you have anything you want to say about it while I try to pull this up?
I mean, we named this episode Maintaining Our Focus for Palestine. And I always appreciate that you ground us there. And I think that I am happy to be having this conversation. You and I were talking about how we need to be having these conversations in a public manner and sort of really looking at them in terms of the longue durée and as um, a political event, and how do we sort of wrap our minds around it. Now, you know me, that I'm also really interested in the psychic elements of this, about where people are going, identifications, all those sorts of things, but really also being aware of how things can uh, not accidentally detract us from the focus here. And that focus is Palestine. So anything I think you and I are going to be talking about today is really to be able to center that this is Palestine we're talking about, that the goal is full liberation of Palestine. It is to center the ongoing atrocities happening in Gaza. And that if we can't think about these things in a larger political analysis, the sure thing will happen is that we will lose sight of what our focus needs to be.
100%. Yeah, so I wanted to read this quote to kind of start us because I think it helps us to ground us again, which is this is from Susan Abu Hawa, who people don't know. She's, amazing Palestinian author, and also just a great, speaker, advocate, activist, all of the things, and also her work with Playgrounds for Palestine, has been moving over the years, and I know that after October 7th, they have done work to basically shift focus a little bit just to provide small school basically for kids in Gaza who, that's one of the great, many tragedies and atrocities of this genocidal war is just the denial of children's ability to just be kids and to do the ordinary things that kids want to do, need to do, and for their education and so on. So, anyway, she wrote Natural Logic. When governments fail to hold Israel accountable for an actual Holocaust being committed before our very eyes, no genocidal Zionist should be safe anywhere in the world. What Mr. Rodriguez did should come as no surprise. In fact, I'm surprised it has not happened sooner. Human beings with a conscience literally cannot bear witness to such evil day in and day out being inflicted upon the bodies, minds, and futures of an utterly defenseless people by such a hateful, racist colonial state, right? And so I just thought that was a lot of where my mind went initially, which is that, and it's funny because a lot of these condemnations that I've seen are coming from socialist organizations, and socialists love to talk about dialectical materialism and having a scientific kind of analysis of things. And they like to use the metaphor quite often of boiling water. I shouldn't say they, I consider myself within this line of thought and all. I'm not trying to separate myself. Um, of so the metaphors around boiling water, right, is that sort of humanity also exists within certain scientific and natural laws, right? And that um and we think about something like conditions producing certain actions, that we have to understand that people can only take so much. And so if we use the metaphor of boiling water, we think about that. Okay, you put a pot of water on a stove and you heat that stove, and when it reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, then it begins to boil,
Mhm.
right? And that this is a scientific natural law. And I think that similarly, we should understand that when people are, you know, I mean, one, that genocide has to be resisted and that genocide is violent. And I don't think people have much of a problem, at least, well, I shouldn't say that. Most people, well, I don't even want to say that. So I think that hopefully most people would understand that there is a requirement, and historically there is a requirement to respond to genocidal acts and actual genocide with force,
Yes.
including force of arms and so on.
Mhm.
And we'll get into some interesting historical examples because even within the museum where this occurred, there's an exhibit to some a Jewish person who killed some Nazi diplomats early on in Nazi Germany, right?
Mm.
And it was a very actually quite interestingly parallel and similar. I don't know whether Elias Rodriguez was, kind of familiar with that parallel or not. But the point being that just historically, everybody's fine talking about World War II or the resistance of, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising or, partisans in Yugoslavia, and that we can have discussions about this. But then when an action like this takes place, there's a need for condemnation.
Yes.
And um, I understand the legal mechanisms that try to impel a condemnation. I mean, even in having this conversations, one of the things I talk to you about is that, we're given guidance here that we have to either be neutral or condemnatory, that those are our two options. And so people should know that we're having a conversation and trying to walk a line too of understanding that context. But that doesn't prevent us from having analysis, from having intellectual, rigorous discussion about these points. And I think that that's an important thing to do. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know where you want to take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I think there's a way in which there's always an invitation, and we've talked about this before, particularly in the context of the United States. I mean, I've mentioned before about the lack of stamina and all these sorts of things. I think it's wrenched from history. I think there's a way in which these become sort of taken in as individual acts and taken out of a political discourse. And that's what you and I are trying to do. And that's why I was actually excited to have this conversation is how do we have forward facing, public facing conversations around political violence, if we want to call it, political interventions. This isn't without precedent in history, like you're saying. And there's all these ways in which people are very comfortable. I mean, I think very early on, you and I were joking about how there needs to be a moratorium on like the Battle of Algiers. If you can, like, people love watching that stuff and are able to sort of metabolize it and be like, oh, this makes sense. Let's follow this line, right? Or we were joking about this too. If you have a red triangle in your bio, like, what do you imagine that red triangle actually represents? And what is the target of that? So there's something really interesting to me about in abstractions how this works, and this is the mechanics of it that I'm interested in looking both politically. How do we constantly center a political analysis that demands actually a lot of us? And it demands a lot of us because of the contradictions internally and the things that we've been socialized into, and our pull to moralization, and our pull in the end to get into the matrix of a hierarchy of who can be celebrated for certain acts and who not. And that's kind of the basis of racism, right? Like, who are we able to metabolize as having the right to enact certain things for their liberatory ends, and then who will always already be positioned as not not a civilian, even if they are, right? But here's the other thing that I'm really interested in, Jay, is that there's this way in which these condemnations run, and we know, right? There's worry about terrorism charges. There's worry about all these sorts of things. I get interested in the sort of preemptive condemnation, and that shows us, that kind of helps us track how far inside this fear is lodged in us, and the way in which people still might function along the lines as though any sort of condemnation is going to help. Or if people were if the state is targeting you, that somehow that condemnation is going to protect you. There's something there that's very interesting to me. The other thing is that when we get into the language of like strategy and what is, useful and what's not useful, is that there's a way in which a invited amnesia sets in. That for the past 18 months, it is a lie to say that this is the line that the state is going to come down hard on you. We have been watching for 18 months the state come down on people wearing kufiyas, on saying from the river to the sea. Like, we forget, those are the early days where the slogan from the river to the sea was...
And people don't even say it anymore, Lara. I mean, like, it worked largely.
That's the thing. And so for us to even... the fact that we're in the terrain of saying that somehow there are right actions and wrong actions, we're already ceding ground philosophically, politically, not in terms of like what is correct strategy. That's not what I'm here to. We can debate this all day long. There've been debates. This is not us who invented this debate, right? But for us to look at the mechanics of it around how, and I'm always interested in the mechanics internally when we cede ground psychically about what is possible, what's not possible, and then create good actors and bad actors. We already cede so much possibility of what could potentially emerge and what is useful in this moment and what is needed as a counterforce to the hogging of all interventions of the state by the state, right? But again, to be truthful and sort of tracking this, because it's almost like we're marking this as this is the thing that's not useful, or this is the thing that will make the state actually respond. I'm hearing a lot of this too. Like, now this is going to be the thing that causes so much violence. And while we understand that, that was the same logic that was used, by the way, right after Al-Aqsa flood, that this will be the thing that causes the Zionist state to respond. And I think there was some critique early on about why would you do this? And I think we in this space to really be careful about the ways in which that marking of a time as though this is the time when everything will get worse by the state is an utter lie. It's a myth. And it completely detracts from everything that has been happening certainly for the past 18 months, but way prior to that. I mean, in the context of this country, whether it's the movement for Black Lives or for No DAPL or for standing, all of those things, we know what the state is capable of. And so for us to mark this, I think, erroneously and say, this is the part where the state now is going to turn and like crank up there's something happening there that I think is more than just fear. And that's the part that I am very aware of. And I'm like really interested in sort of having this conversation so we can stay ourselves. Yeah,
no, absolutely. It's very funny because, I mean, I'm somebody, this is not necessarily a good trait, but I'm always influenced by sort of one of the last things that I read, like whatever that is. Like, certain things stick with me, but you read a book and last week, was it? I think I went on, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago now, I went on the Red Nation podcast and had a conversation with Nick Estes. He asked me to come on and talk about Jay Sakai's Settlers, which, is a book that I think is a really important book to read. I also, I don't even say criticisms, because as I went through it, rereading it for that show, there's really not anything that I disagree with in terms of what he lays out, but maybe my orientation to that history and what I think about as possibilities and how I would think about organizing might be different, right? But you can't really argue with the sort of facts of it. But one of the things that he talks about in that book that struck me particularly reading it through this time, was that he has this critique of the US left and how we talk about McCarthyism.
Mhm.
And it's really interesting because he's like, look, he's like, this was not state repression of the sort that real revolutionary movements face. And I'll walk through it a little bit for
Mhm.
folks.
Please.
You know, he's like, look, if you look at what happens in any anti-colonial movement, any revolutionary movement that the state is actually trying to completely destroy, there is a level of violence and, a lack of, uh, red lines,
Yes.
right? About how they will approach that struggle. I mean, Gaza obviously is the most glaring example we can look at right now.
Yeah.
But this is true throughout history. And he wasn't, he was talking about this in the 80s, thinking about the anti-colonial movements. And he was also thinking about the Black Panthers, the
Mhm.
Young Lords,
Mhm.
the Puerto Rican nationalists,
Mhm.
AIM. Like he wasn't just talking about it in the sense of, um, just whatever, like the Algerian Revolution or, some of these situations where he was also talking about movements that happened within the so-called first world that had a liberationist edge and were particularly connected to revolutionary nationalist projects. And so he's saying this to say, and he levies this critique. He's like, look, if some congressional hearings and a couple people being deported and maybe somebody going to prison, and one, he does talk about the execution of the Rosenbergs, right? Um, but he said if these are the things that can cause your entire organization to basically have to go underground, to disappear, to retreat, to become irrelevant, essentially, which I think most people who lived through the late 60s and early 70s don't feel like CPUSA in that moment was, a leading edge of revolutionary struggle anymore. If we want to say that it might have been in the early 20th century and, up through maybe the New Deal era, although he critiques some of that as well. But the point being that so I just say that to say, like, you know, why is it that we're so afraid of like congressional hearings or our nonprofit status being stripped up or us being taken off of YouTube,
Yeah.
right? As the consequences when, like, we're talking about something that is totally existential right now for the Palestinian people and is also beyond them about the kind of world that we want to live in and whether people are going to resist these things or not. And I just think that that's an interesting thing to wrestle with in terms of the history of left-wing organizations in the United States that, some of them weren't able to have congressional hearings and, take a step back. Some of them were executed and annihilated, and locked up. And I understand not wanting these things to happen. Like, we don't want any of these things to happen. But it is a kind of, again, as you're talking about these hierarchies of, humanity and who gets what kind of process, and even trying to avoid the congressional hearing or the nonprofit status being stripped or whatever else. Like, I just think we need to be very conscious of all the ways that we're retreating when we start to move in that way.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And a misattunement to the fact and perhaps a disavowal that in doing that, you are actually setting up a target on somebody else. You don't get to do that. Yeah, move. Exactly. You don't get to do that. You don't get to retract. You don't get to say, oh, I don't want to have congressional hearings or put out statements condemning. Um, again, I want to say this explicitly politically motivated action. Explicit. This is not, there's no two ways around it. Like explicit, like how much more explicit do you want it to be? when somebody said, this is exactly what is the target. This is why this is a legitimate target, right? These things have history. By the way, this is something that the quote unquote Israeli government does all the time, targeting diplomats, targeting people. I mean, in the context of Lebanon, if we think about the beeper attack, right? Just sort of who gets to be considered quote unquote combatant and an enemy, and who is allowed innocence despite explicitly working for the state as a state agent. And these are the larger conversations that we're having. But I think the point in the context of the United States is that when you do those things, I think this is the part that bothers me the most, is that there's a sort of almost like a lack of honesty about what is actually happening and what part of the machine and the machinery are you activating when you start to rush to do these things. You cannot do that except at the expense of everything that's to the left flank of you, right? And that's the piece that we're talking about here. And we've talked about this before, is that people are happy to excise militants out of their ranks just to stabilize whatever version of, let's face it, the United States that they want to hold on to. And that's the piece that's central to this. If we're connecting this with Palestine, we need to also constantly be centering how settler colonialism and settler colonial logics works even within the context of this, or I should say, especially within. If you are trying to stabilize a settler colonial nation that was built on genocide, this is not a, just a rhetorical statement. This is what I mean by centering how these logics continue to saturate every single day life for us. The indigenous folks of this land that is stolen, right? I remember sitting back, see, like, do you see what we're talking about, motherfuckers? Like, you want to stabilize this version of this nation state that you care so much about. And despite your rhetoric, you are invested psychologically, materially, politically in the liberal version of this nation state. And we cannot reconcile that when we're talking about decolonization or dismantling settler colonialism. So for me, when I see these things, they might look like contradictions on the surface, but they work really well when your analysis is one around settler colonialism and the ways in which it seamlessly finds itself, and what are the sort of goals that people have. Like, there's the mayoral candidate in New York, right? And people are like, oh, that he thinks that the settler state has the right to exist. And I'm like, are you surprised here? Like, that's, I think, the dishonesty of this is like, anything that's going to be channeled through electoral lines is going to look like that. Anything that in the end has the longevity and the future of settlers on this stolen land in mind is going to stabilize when there is an escalation that happens. And I think that we need to get better at sort of contending with that and just sort of being clear. And that's what it means by maintaining focus. We need to be clear. And this is just descriptive, like what Suzanne said, the tweet that you put up. Of course, she's going to get a lot of pushback about that, but like, that's a descriptive statement. That is the most descriptive statement I have seen. In fact, we have seen extreme restraint across the world over the past 18 months. In terms of what are some of the things that we've been seeing, which needs to happen as well. Zionist tourists, IOF soldiers going and taking vacation and being kicked out of places. I think that that's a fair response when you're on, social media showing how you're blowing up homes. I think that's a necessary response. But by and large, I think we also have to understand, just she's saying, this is a descriptive statement. What do you think is going to happen when you act with impunity and no quote unquote governing bodies are stepping in to do anything? 2 days ago, the IOF shot at EU and Arab diplomats. Like, then this is just like we're stabilizing a world in which that is quote unquote natural. And then these things are not, I think this is back to what you were saying before about boiling water and sort of the natural flow of things. But there's something patterned about this, and I think paying attention to the structural pieces and how it gets saturated and why it goes in this direction feels really important to me to remain focused.
Yeah. I think also, like, I don't want to infer too much about this person, but it sounds like, based on what I've seen, that this is a person who had been a part of the left for quite some time. I mean, the analysis in the statement that is alleged to be from him,
Yeah.
is quite clear. It's quite clear-eyed in terms of the analysis, whether people agree with it or not, whatever. Like, but the there's a logic to it that you can follow all the way through to the end. And I think that the one of the things that is interesting is that the same organizations who are condemning this, I think, also need to grapple with the fact that this is a product of the inability to be able to stop this. Like, that there are thresholds and there are ways that things escalate. And again, to Susan's point, there's so much that human beings can bear
Yeah.
before they just can't anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we've long since passed that point for folks. I mean, Aaron Bushnell, and this is something, maybe we talk about this a little bit too. I mean, it is very fascinating to me, the people who get lifted up even when they take individualistic action, and the people who then get condemned for individual action, and like where those lines are for folks, I think
Yes.
is a really interesting thing. But what I wanted to say is that, and I am not here to condemn anyone, and I'm not here to condemn organizations who have been trying to figure out how to organize amid this and have tried different tactics, but nothing has stopped this yet. And so there also has to be some self-reflection of, you know, like, we're in a moment where the ethnic cleansing of Gaza could happen. There are plans that are openly said. The Israelis call it the Trump plan now, gleefully, to ethnically cleanse Gaza.
And the
There
two
is
people who were shot also supported that.
They supported it, absolutely. I mean, you can go and read, again, the Twitter timeline of the man. At least I haven't spent, like I said, I haven't spent as much time looking into the woman's, tweets and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's egregious, the positions that this person had. I mean, atrocious.
Yes.
And it's not like it's kind of like if, after Dylan Roof did what he did, people were like, "Oh, well, this guy, like, you know, there were all the signs here. He had, support for Nazis, support for apartheid South Africa, etc." Like, I get those kind of vibes when I read this person's timeline, and that's, again, like, this is the context.
Yes.
Um, is that, you know, I there's this strong dissonance of, on the one level, I think everybody understands right now that there is a Holocaust level, genocide that is being enacted, that obviously is being resisted by Palestinians first and foremost, by Yemenis
Mm-hmm.
actually doing the thing. I mean, there's that meme that's going around now of, "I support military intervention to stop the Gaza genocide." And as people have said, well, why don't you just say, "I support Ansar Allah," or "I support the Yemenis"? Like, there is a state actor that is actually doing this, and nobody recognizes, as a result of them doing this, they don't even recognize the legitimacy of them as a state actor. Um, but the I mean, it's just, we're in that moment where we've diagnosed it as a genocide,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody is behaving like it.
Mm.
right? And so then when somebody does behave like it, they're deemed to be the crazy person, or the,
Yes.
the ultra leftist, or the adventurist, or whatever else.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the part that's really difficult for me, is I don't see a lot of the I mean, I know that it's happening. I should be clear. Like, I know that people are, I'm on plenty of text chains and stuff like that, where people are, frustrated by our own inability to make a dent through any other means.
Yes.
Or that's the way they feel, at least, which I think we should talk about that too, because,
Yep.
but anyways, I've said a lot. Go ahead.
No, this is it. But I think, part of it is you're calling into question it. If you're unable to do things materially, we've talked about this before. And by the way, the Yemenis are acting in alignment with international law, right? The joke that international law is that they're acting like that is what we're beholden to. And the settler state is signatory to these things and is just acting, as a pariah state, as it does and as it always has, by the way, as a rogue state. So that's number one. But I think there are ways in which, if you feel you materially cannot rise to the level, and you and I have talked about before, that not everybody's going to be doing these actions, right? We see that. What does it mean for us to not bend in our rhetoric and in our stances, and to be militantly clear about what is needed? I think that's important too. I don't think that's nothing. That's precisely what we're saying, is that there's a dissemination of discourse that happens, and a weakening of political analysis when these condemnations happen. Is not just because we look at it and we go, what the fuck are you doing 18 months later? There's literally 14,000 babies in Gaza are going to die of starvation, and this is the deflection that you're taking. We can be angry at that, but also understand that this is a new phase of normalization that happens when we start to get into these semantic and sort of strategic arguments that are happening. So there is an actual political currency and importance for us to practice what it means to not to hold the line, to not rush into and if we feel that impulse, I'm also on discussions where, like, you can be honest about feeling that impulse. And then part of what our conversations have been is to also step in and sort of psychically understand what is being demanded of you in that moment. That impulse to condemn, where is that coming from? Is it out of fear of state action? And then to sort of unpack and recognize all the moving pieces, rather than just think this is it. That's the point of ideology, is supposed to hide seamlessly. The more we can sort of get sharp at recognizing and pointing out and outlining all the moving pieces, that are many, by the way, that pull us in to identifications with certain things, whether that's liberal discourses around peace and quote unquote senseless violence, which is one of my favorite things. Like this idea of senseless violence, I'm just like, even the violence that's happening in the genocide, that is not senseless, that is targeted, that is political. And that's the piece of, like, just the language that we use around this. So being accurate, being precise, being militant in our ability to hold that and work out the contradictions. I'm not saying that's actually our responsibility as leftists, is to constantly be working out contradictions, talking about strategies, talking about these sorts of things. But I just kind of want to say this, that I think a lot of times people say, well, what's the point? Oh, so I don't condemn. And then no, there's a point, because when we start doing that, it opens up the door for so much else to get naturalized. There needs to be a line that we're holding, and to practice and flex our muscles, like kind of like what you were saying about to constantly be grounding this in a political analysis. Otherwise, it's individualistic indulgence. And that's not a cause. Individualistic indulgence and how you feel about morality and all those sort of things, like those are important pieces to see, where am I in on this spectrum, and what do I sort of attend to. But there's a larger cause that we're talking about, and that cause is Palestine. That cause is the liberation of Palestine. That cause is to rectify the horror that is happening right now. And like you're saying, the steady march towards ethnic cleansing, which has been happening since 1948, by the way. We just passed May 15th, which was the anniversary of the Nakba. So that is, I think, and just kind of wanting to underscore that there is an actual utility to this. It's not just an empty statement. There's an actual utility for us to practice these things. The other thing that I was going to say is that you're saying, you know, what are the people that some people uphold and are able to sort of identify with and whatnot is, I mean, these are part of the psychic inversions we're talking about, who becomes the aggressor and who's not, right? But also for us to kind of attune to what's the infrastructure that's available that can pop into action immediately in moments like this, that becomes the oil for the machine, right? Is that like when Luigi Mangione, you know, allegedly shoots a CEO, there's not much infrastructure in the United States around like, let's read this. In fact, what the infrastructure is the fuckery of insurance companies and how many people they've killed. That springs into motion. When this happens, we see the infrastructure that has been meticulously laid down, right? Through counterinsurgency, through imperialism, through capitalism, about number one, Arab hate, Islamophobia, terror, Zionism, America first, jingoism, all this sort of shit is already there. And I think that's part of it, is that because then what gets activated is folks might feel like they're in a bind of like, oh, if I align myself with this, what are the other things that I am having to disidentify from, or vice versa, right? And that's the place I think for us to constantly be pushing up against, is these identifications. Where are they coming from? Who are they at the expense of? What is it deflective from? But the heart of all of this is fucking racism. And that's why we see a genocide that continues to happen 18 months later, that we are continuously watching this despite escalations. Like you're saying, there have been escalations, whether it's Palestine Action or any one of these. There have been a lot of escalations. A lot of politicians, as they should be, are not allowed to eat in silence. They're not allowed to sleep in silence. They're not allowed to do any of these things. But that's the spectrum we're talking about. And so again, I like the arbitrary lines on which the spectrum ends for certain people, I think is the place where the infrastructure of racism begins, right? Is that, wait a second, you know, we're okay with having the people being slaughtered be the ones who are fighting this fight, right? Because, and there's something deeply, deeply, deeply racist about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, and this gets to comments I've had with people, you know, about the feeling of being reduced to cheerleaders, right? Or, you know, and again, like I think it's just, we just need to be really attuned, as you say, to like, why do we feel okay watching like resistance videos or, um, you know, praising certain actions? I mean, you saw more people, more organizations condemn what happened yesterday than condemn October 7th. Now, again, I'm still here, still saying don't condemn October 7th, just for the record. But the, you know, it was fascinating in that way, because also, as many people pointed out, myself included, but also appreciated the abolition school, you know, you know, you could just be quiet. Like, you could just sit there and eat your food, right?
Yep.
You don't actually have to say anything at all, right? And silence sometimes is a much better option than participating in this theater of condemnation. I mean, it's like watching nonprofit organizations read the Pledge of Allegiance. That's what I felt like I was reading yesterday, right? Like, yes, settler empire, we pledge allegiance to, you know, everything that you say, right? And I just think that like the part of another thing that's happening is and we can talk about this, because of course there are strategic and tactical disagreements.
Yes.
I get it. Like, I think actually that's fine. I don't really think Twitter is the place for those disagreements. But if people are so inclined, that's fine. I also always question when people use a precise moment like this to then have those strategic and tactical disagreements.
Yeah.
But like that is what organizations do, is they talk about strategy and tactics, and they should,
Yeah.
um and as you said, it's a long-standing debate. I mean, a lot of Marxists throughout history have had a real dislike for these forms of actions, and at the same time have also been inspired often by them as well. And we could talk about that a little bit, but there are certain ideological and political tendencies that come out in these moments, and that's a little bit less interesting to me. I mean, I think that's very important, but it's not really what I'm talking about, because it wasn't the language of tactical and strategic efficacy that you saw in these statements that were put out by organizations. It was a language of moral condemnation.
Correct.
And I also think, I mean, beyond the kind of racism and the choices of like who are we going to like, I felt like we haven't learned a lot of the really important lessons that Palestinians have been teaching us for many years, but particularly have said over and over again, in great ways since October 7th, which is just like you have to refuse that. The whole thing that Palestinians were forced for decades to, like, in order to come on our platform, like, you have to condemn Hamas. Like, this is a requirement of you talking to us, right? And like, what is that doing? Mohammed Al-Kurd has written really beautifully about this stuff. Other folks have as well. Um, and so there's that. There's like, we have all these great examples of people refusing that, being put in that position. But the other side of it is like, people, I mean, I don't know what's going on behind closed doors. I don't know who's in what conversations with the state, or with, DOJ, or, ADL, or whatever is going on. I get that, though, there are those pressure mechanisms that are there for people, but the optics of it, for sure, are just that you just couldn't quickly enough distance yourself from this through a moral framework, which is also funny because a lot of these people will be the first to tell you, like, we don't need moral frameworks, we need material ones,
Yeah.
and so, like, it didn't go into a place, like, afterward I saw people having the tactical strategic conversations,
Yes.
but that wasn't, it wasn't statements like, we don't think this is going to be effective, and so, we don't encourage others to do it, right?
Yeah.
Which, again, like, why would you need to do that? But if you needed to do something, I at least can kind of see where you're at, but it wasn't that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the moralization for me is shameful and abhorrent, because the lessons we should have learned from the last 18 months, like I'm saying, is that it doesn't work. So what you've done is like tenfold destructive, right? Because it doesn't work no matter what you do in the eyes of the state or Zionist machinery or whatever it is. You're always already guilty to begin with because you fight for Palestine. So what you've actually done, there's no movement on this side. There's only movement in terms of, again, what I was saying is the creation of good actors and bad actors that end up only being used to further sideline militancy. And that is the real, that's why it's abhorrent, the moralizing. And the moralizing here, that this is what I'm saying is so shameful. It's like, I want to say in Arabic, like aib, aib. It's so shameful when we have more than 200,000 people having been slaughtered, that this becomes the line. And yes, these organizations have been saying that, but to even draw a moral equivalency around this is so disrespectful. And that is what individualizes. This is what I mean about the infrastructure that sort of pops into motion, is you have now individualized this and wrenched it from its political context in recognizing this as one of many, like you said, you don't need, if this person isn't part of your fucking organization, Don't say anything, right? You're not laying claim. As far as I know, this person didn't lay claim to anything, didn't say, I'm affiliated with this, I'm acting on behalf of, to the contrary. So this is what I mean about like the kind of unpacking the mechanics of this, and this sort of rush also to separate, individualize, is one of many tactics to dislodge this from a larger political fabric and a conversation that we have to be having about our responsibilities to the world, by the way. The other thing is that in doing that, whether or not you meant to, you've also distanced yourself and made a commentary on your position on political prisoners, our political prisoners who continue to be imprisoned for similar actions. George Abdallah being at the top of my mind in France, right? Who assassinated an American military attaché and an Israeli diplomat, and who several judges have said needs to be released. I think I've said this before, that Hillary Clinton intervened. This, whether you like it or not, there is no way around this. We're always worried about siding with empire and all the sort of arguments around that in our region, and imperial interventionism and all these sorts of things. Making the moral argument in this way and erasing the political connections here, the political target, the political, like, and maybe that becomes our conversation about what constitutes that, right? But these are representatives, state representatives of a genocidal, apartheid, settler colonial state that have made no qualms about making their position known about what they believe Palestinians' fate should be in Gaza. And that is being ethnically cleansed and murdered, right? This is not some random thing. And this is the other piece. When you make a comment like that, there's also a way in which you're inviting associations to the quote unquote randomness of it, right? That somehow this happened in some obscure place and that this target was completely disconnected, and that's what makes it. And when we see the language of hate crime, of course, being generated, let's not, take away the fact that the person was Christian, German, all these sorts of things, but it moves it into that terrain where now we are sort of overlaying and anachronistically sort of putting a narrative of randomness on this, when number one, this is in the terrain of the United States that is responsible for this genocide. It is singularly responsible for the continuation of this genocide, for the arming of the settler state. There is nothing random about it, but those associations, when we make statements like that, it does kick up that infrastructure that allows it then to ride on the tails of the things we've been seeing all along, right? That this is some senseless anti-Semitic act, that this is an increasing targeting of Jewish folks, all these sorts of things, none of which is actually true if we're looking at it when we're looking at it as a political analysis. And I think we have to be very precise and careful about that, because that infrastructure is there to go, right? It's ready to run.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, I do think it's important to, this person, the man was a German Israeli 3-year IDF veteran, chose to go to the IDF, like was born in Germany, right? So like chose to go to Israel to join the IDF, and also is a Christian, right? And I think that this is another point too, because again, like, look, I understand all of this, but we need to be precise here because it's important. We're talking about a German Israeli Christian Zionist that was a member of the military of Israel, right? And is now an embassy, apparatchik of the state, and recently tweeted out he's tweeting out propaganda about that starvation is faked in Gaza, like that, this kind of stuff. This comment I wanted to raise up because I thought this is a really important point, and it was something on my mind as well. Um, a lot of Marxists, including Lenin, have a particular disdain for these kind of actions. However, Lenin in particular was coming from a context where there was an organized left. And I think this is a really important thing for people to understand, is that the range of action that was available in Tsarist Russia, and in the revolutionary periods of, building Soviets, and, people organizing within the Red Army, and, or the, the Russian army, and then, the Red Army, but the, strikes and all these, so if you take really high waters of revolutionary movements and then try to pull the analysis out of those contexts and apply it to right now and say, hey, like this Marxist theorist who I have a lot of respect for, um, he disagreed with these types of actions. He thought that they were counterproductive, etc. Like, look, I don't know. I can't predict what Lenin or Marx or Mao would say right now. Like, you can't. It's not the same context. And for the United States left to constantly compare itself with the high tide of a revolutionary movement, which had the first successful, revolution into, trying to build a socialist state project, I think is just painfully naive, you know? And there's also like people, I saw somebody trot out the Fred Hampton clip of talking about the Weathermen during the Days of Rage. Days of Rage was this, it was a mass action called of just, hey, let's get together and let's fuck shit up in Chicago, basically. Like, and look, I'm not I'm not here to say anything ill of Fred Hampton. I have, obviously he was an amazing, amazing person. He was also killed by the state and he didn't participate in that action.
Precisely.
Uh and a lot of the Weather Underground folks are still alive.
Yes.
And we can talk about how, yes, like they're largely white, they came from a higher class background. So all of those things worked in their favor when they finally had to turn themselves into the state or were caught or captured or whatever. Right? That's real. Like, and there's a very real, that the hierarchy that we're talking about, you can see in those places. But this also, I mean, you can listen to Daruba bin Wahad talk about this and say, look, weather was on the right side of the barricades. I don't agree with what Fred had to say, and so it's not, we take these, it's dogma, in my opinion, to pull these examples out of history and use that to short circuit the need. It's an alibi.
Yeah.
Felicia Deneau made me think about this recently. When we look for alibis, when we look for reasons that we're going to short circuit political analysis of this situation right now and what should be done and what shouldn't be done, and pull from something that somebody said in a different context, where different possibilities were there, different organizations, different ways that people were trying to move. And look, that exists now to some degree, but I just think that we're not close to where we were in terms of organization in the late 60s, and we're nowhere in the same realm of, revolutionary Russia.
Yep. Yes. And I think, here's the thing. I think there is something really important happening in terms of like global South and global North and working this stuff out. And this is not a factionalism statement. You know me, I'm against factionalism. As you were talking about, like, what would Marx say about this? I'm thinking about Bakunin. Like, they had those fights, right? About like, you get in the fucking street now or no, you hold off and you don't get into the street until afterwards. But I think there is something about what I might call individualist rot, right? Like individually, like still acting in forms of individualism or imagining things as individualistic because that is the worldview that you're oriented towards or it's shoved down your throat. And that's why I'm calling it individualistic rot around it. Because even when folks act in opposition to, let's say, like you're saying, these theorists or these sort of Marxist theorists or any one of these things, there's an imagination that somehow they're acting as individuals. And I think it's because there's a way in which we're not attuned to the cause that they are connected to. That there are folks, for reasons like you're saying, like what's available to them, how they organize. You talked about Abdul Jawad sort of talking about lone wolf, all these sorts of things. That is imagined as an individualistic intervention. Just because one person does it doesn't mean it's individualistic, because you're beholden to a cause. And that's the cause that you will always center. And that's what we mean about maintaining focus for Palestine. Because if you center that cause, there are individual actions we might be doing that is an antagonism with these points in time in history where there wasn't that much surveillance, or we weren't sort of looking at it this way, or the options were more, let's say, a myriad of ways that you could intervene, which just aren't available to us. They aren't. This is what we were talking about, sort of asymmetrical, right? Fighting and sort of maneuvering. That's, I think, the other thing that I want to bring into focus here as you're talking about that is it occurred to me that like people will look and be like, that's an individualist act, because the invisible part of this is that there are folks who are committed to a cause. And I think that this is what I mean by global South, Morton. And I don't mean literal, like just global South, global North sort of dynamics and politics that are sort of being borne out here and worked through and contested, is that these are the things we should be also thinking about. And like, that's what I mean about the clarity of the political action. This was not, the clarity was very much around a cause. And that's also the piece when we moralize. It's just like, okay, then you open up a lot for contestation when you sort of rush in with this. And that contestation is never going to be on the side of those of us who oppose the state and oppose that the state gets to own all the means of violence, right? In any struggle, let alone one that's about liberation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think, I mean, one of the things that's also interesting too is just the number of people, like history. I'm trying to decide where I want to go with this because there's a couple of different things on my mind right now. But I guess to move into one point before moving on is just that it is much easier to look at these things historically and to have a different perspective on them, right? It's much different when you are in the thick of it, and in the thick of it, in the moment, people can think, this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do. And, we look back and people praise Jonathan Jackson, as Joy James said, we remember the attempts to be free, right? Like this, that we can look at these actions that at the time people thought many people thought Jonathan Jackson's action was adventurous.
Mm-hmm.
Many people thought that it was suicidal, that it was reckless, that it was all of these things. Now we look back at it and we remember him as a martyr who was dedicated to the cause of liberating his brother and of, freedom for his people. And people read his words as George Jackson's pulling them into blood in my eye, or in letters that he wrote back and forth to him and so on. Right. And so it's easy. And my understanding too with that is the Panthers didn't want any part of that specific action to try to free George Jackson, right? They didn't want to be a part of it. right? And that's okay, right? But it also means that, when you see now organizations like putting these people on t-shirts, I mean, George Jackson, he famously said, terror tactics like lynching will never be allowed to work on us. If terror is going to be the choice of weapons, there must be funerals on both sides, and let the whole enemy power complex be conscious of that,
Mhm.
right? That doesn't sound like somebody who's like, would be sitting here right now writing a condemnation from his prison cell of, the action that took place the day before yesterday.
Mhm.
So there's also these ways, I think, that, and this is also the one of the frustrations that people have with nonprofits in movements and with organizations who, they pull a 501c3 and all of this, is that people will take all of the branding from these revolutionaries and put it on their stuff, but then want to turn around and condemn certain types of action. And so, yeah,
Yes.
it just, I just wanted to say that before moving into something else. But yeah,
Yeah,
you have
and
thoughts?
not be honest about the fact that by virtue of taking on that nonprofit status, you're already constricted in terms of what you're able to do and how you're able to maneuver. And like, so taking on that branding is also dishonest. And like, that's fine. I'm not one
And it
who's,
confuses people about what these people were about. Like,
yes,
it participates in the confusion and the psychological war that is waged by the state and mainstream media against who revolutionaries were, what they thought, and
right.
what they did.
That's right. And it neutralizes. I mean, it demobilizes us politically. It neutralizes certain things. It defangs them. It domesticates them. That's the point, right? And listen, there might be a space in which nonprofits are doing the work that they need to do, but like, again, the responsibility to not reach beyond the confines of what you're able to do, and then afterwards show your over and over and over again, show your face, show the face of those limitations. Because again, this is the point of like creating who the bad guys are and who they aren't, because you will always be able to fall back on the condemnation, but those are constitutively part of the lane that you're in. So for us also to understand that when we see these things is to recognize them and to recognize perhaps our own pull to identify with these spaces as spaces of, let's say, of legitimate liberation, that they can take us there, right? And I think many of us don't have that. I'm not saying we think that nonprofits are the things that are going to liberate us, but I think sometimes psychically we're pulled in to think they can go further than they can. And these are reminders for us not to be shocked when these things happen, but instead to revisit the constitutive limitations around them, which is what then that opens up a call for us about if we are functioning outside of those confines, what is the spectrum of action and movement and organization that we have to be doing? We need to be divesting from all these and we've been doing versions of that over, divesting from electoral politics, divesting from these sorts of things. But these moments for me are moments of reckoning with the things that continue to be intimately lodged inside of us. We've talked about this before, is that these moments of inflection are the place of truth telling around conscious and unconscious identifications that we have with the state, with a liberal order, with anything that we think we're aligned with politically. It's an invitation, which is part of why I was excited to have this conversation, to be like, listen, these inflection points are going to happen. Can we responsibly engage them and be honest with ourselves, hopefully with comrades that we trust and organize with, around the polls that we're experiencing internally? Because we're not outside. It's not like, oh, we live outside the structure and then the structure just keeps on. There's no way to do that. For us to be effective, we need to constantly be checking in about what are the various polls that oftentimes actually surprise us. They're meant to be surprising. It was like, holy shit, I thought I've actually worked through that identification, or I thought that I didn't have this, myth still in me. But if we think about these structures as saturating every part of our life and animating our internal and psychic dynamics, why wouldn't these things happen? What's important for me is that we catch it, we sort of are able to acknowledge what's happening, and not just acknowledge what's happening internally on an individualistic perspective, is to say that this is part of the machinery of counterinsurgency. This is part of the machinery of empire. This is part of the machinery of settler colonial logics. That's the only way we can get out of this individualistic, moralizing stance that I think a lot of people get pulled into.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to pull this thing up quickly because I think it was just an interesting contradiction. I kind of referenced it earlier. So just to say that the museum where this event took place, the Museum of Jewish History, a living memorial to the Holocaust, right? And I think that's it's a living memorial to the Holocaust, right? And in November 1938, Herschel Greenspan, a Jewish refugee living in Paris, walked into his city's German embassy and assassinated Nazi diplomat Ernest von Rath. He was just 17 years old. His actions would be later used as a justification for the Kristallnacht, the violent anti-Semitic pogrom which took place later that month. And now 83 years later, Herschel has largely faded into history. And so they have a program at the museum which explores his story, how it came to be used as propaganda, and why it was ultimately forgotten. And, I just thought that this, and then they have a short book that they reference, The Short Strange Life of Herschel Greenspan, a Boy Avenger. And look, I don't know what their program around this teaches, right? I mean, obviously, again, we can, as they say, like this was used as part of the justification for Kristallnacht, right? So like actions can have all, and this is to get to sort of the Marxist critique of certain actions like this, is to say that it can bring down the forces of the state in, even greater than they are right now. And, part of, Joe Emmersberger, last week I was on Takey Group Therapy, and, he said this thing about, how he used to get really worried about that Russia, Ukraine would lead to nuclear war, right? And or that other conflicts, this is something that we think about on the left. Obviously, we don't want nuclear war and so on. But he's like, I'm liberated from that now. Like, I don't actually sit and think about that anymore because, I've accepted that if what is happening in Gaza is being allowed to happen, like why do we get to be exempt from this like death spiral of this planet, And I mean, I get that this is kind of, again, to you're moving into sort of a moral, realm and things like this in having that kind of discussion, but I empathize with it strongly, of just why do risky action, why is our analysis that risky action or actions that could produce certain consequences can only happen in the places that are like being surrounded by drones constantly,
Yeah.
And that are already facing the most significant consequences of life and death that extend to people who are not even participating in the actions in any kind of way, right? To children, right? There's
Yeah.
a particularly horrible tweet that I want to share in a minute too about that. And yeah, so
Yeah.
I just think that that's important to kind of keep in mind too, is like what are we doing right now that one is so amazing and so close to achieving our aims that we are afraid is going to be set back by this action, but also, why is it that we should take the least risk within empire,
Mhm.
and that the most risk should be taken and borne by people who are under,
Yeah.
who are risking annihilation?
Mhm.
It gets back to the hierarchy you brought up in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, shout out to Joe too. I appreciate these interventions. But really, and the other piece of this is that type of logic, which he says he's liberated from, and I believe that, I think many of us are, it belies a sort of psychic investment in a liberal order, that liberal social order of the world, in which there's a version of this world that there is something you can't, if you just didn't do one thing, it wouldn't, the steps of annihilation wouldn't unfold. That it becomes that, like, you bear the onus of this one action is the thing that if you just withheld that, the genocide wouldn't be happening. That is a psychic investment in a particular social order that doesn't take into account the logics of settler colonialism that are fundamentally based on genocide and an annihilation of an indigenous peoples, right? There is no version or action that you can withhold or not do, or I think that's really important for us. And I'm not saying this from nihilistic. I am the furthest person away from nihilism. I'm saying there's an honesty to reading a particular type of constitutive logic of violence by the state and by settler colonial state to boot, right? To say that these become deflective points and points of intervention that people are asked to join as conscription. So the onus comes to be on individual actors rather than a state, right? Like, there are things we've been doing that haven't been, so withholding something is also not, it's really important for us. It sounds like it's crazy making, but the more we get precise and accurate about unpacking and acknowledging and sort of laying out the sequence of events and resorting to a structural political analysis of empire and settler colonialism, I think we can divest more easily from these places where we're like still believing that somehow an action we don't do is going to stop this fucking genocidal machine, when nothing has stopped it. I will say, though, what has deterred it, what has made it sort of have to admit that it is not omnipotent, that's the only actual action we have to see. What are the actions that have forced this genocidal apartheid settler colonial regime, right, to show itself as not the omnipotent force that it projects itself to be? And that's been resistance. I'm sorry, this is a descriptive statement.
I think, and I think this is a really important point to pivot to also, which is just that I feel like a lot of the condemnations, I think, are coinciding with a lot of folks of, I have a sense, this is my speculation and opinion, but that there is a retreat that people are feeling, that people are becoming more fearful, and that they, and this is not a mass thing, because like there's a lot of wins happening that people are not celebrating. There's a lot of things happening. There is a shift that's going on. And there was, this is, I think, why people delve into conspiracy theories too, and think like, oh, this is a false flag, because there was all this momentum going on and so on. But the point on the momentum, I mean, that for anybody who hasn't seen it, go watch Electronic Intifada's episode yesterday. I'm sure that everybody's here probably already saw it, because rightfully so, many more people tune into their weekly broadcasts, and should. But great interview with Frank McGinnis, an attorney from South Armagh, who is fighting a ton of cases within the UK right now. And like, if you need, 30 minutes of revolutionary inspiration, like, just go watch that and watch the whole thing, because it was amazing, beautiful conversation with Abu Bakr and Ali, and just good stuff all around. But his interview was so important, I think, for people to sit with, because he's just saying, look, like, and we've heard versions of this in the US, like, these are not actions, the state actions that are being taken, the trying to, scoop people off the street for writing an op-ed, or, banning international students from going to Harvard, saying that they're an organ of the Chinese Communist Party too, by the way, which is just the
Yes.
funniest thing I've ever seen. Uh, and you know, like, these are not actions that are taken by, governments and political ideologies that are, like, really sure of themselves and that are, on the ascension.
Mhm.
Like, we're experiencing a time when people feel, particular to be precise, political Zionists, their logic has been completely exposed as to the inherent racism in it, the requirement of apartheid for it,
Yes.
the requirement of ethnic cleansing and genocide in order to preserve their sense of safety.
Mhm.
Um, and that if anyone, I mean, like, what was the commentary about Miss Rachel of, the fact that she shows love to Palestinian children makes a lot of Jewish parents feel really unsafe right now.
Mhm.
I mean, like, the kinds of admissions that you are seeing from Zionists, to be clear, um, is just staggering. And I think that, people need to not behave as though we are losing just because we haven't won,
Mhm.
right? And so just because it is, a very dire time, and I appreciated this comment, even though it's critical of what we're doing here. I I am absolutely tired of seeing dead babies every day. I think everybody is here too, and I think people do get tired of just talking in circles and, trying. I get it. Like, I will say this, I don't care if anyone adopts my political analysis. Like, if people are acting to try to stop this in the ways that they can, I could care less if they agree with me. And I mean, this movement is full of people with a variety of political ideologies and orientations. And I support everybody who is, taking action. Even people at this point, like, I'll be honest, like, I don't really care if certain people are reactionary, if they're actually, like, doing something meaningful and material around this specific thing right now. Like, and so that's where I'm at on it. And only reason that we do have these conversations is because we also, I think, feel like for many people they are important in on some level of clarity, and to be able to dig through the kind of muck in psychological ideological warfare that is
Yes.
a part of this struggle as well.
Mhm.
um
Mhm.
but I don't think that we should assume, just because of the horrific realities that we're seeing every day, that we have lost, that it is that assume a nihilistic outcome to this, assume that they will be successful in ethnically cleansing completely, the Gaza Strip. That also needs to be paired with an urgency of action, of militancy, of clarity, of, and those things can take a variety of forms, as we have often talked about.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I just want to sort of respond also to that. Um I think it's Erica that's in there.
Yeah.
That I I can't I think I can speak for both Jay and myself that this is not the only thing. It can't just be talking in circles. I don't think that it's talking in circles though, and here's why. I think the force of the structures to deflect from the reality that babies are dying and babies are being blown up and babies are being starved and why that happened is so intense that not everybody has the clarity that you do. Not everybody has the clarity to be like, there are babies dying. In fact, what I hear more and more and more is people being invited, seduced away from that. So I think continuing to have these conversations, not as a replacement for action, but as a consistent checking in and a reminder and a recognition that there are forces that are bigger that try to isolate us and try. That's why this is called maintaining focus on Palestine. Like, it's maintaining focus that the reason why everything that we should be doing is in service of the cause of the liberation of Palestine, so that it's not just and not at all those babies that are getting the brunt of all of this. And it's to shift a world in which the possibility of that happening is no longer viable, right? And so I'm really happy to hear. I'm always delighted when people are like, right on, I'm right there. This is what I'm focusing on. In my experience, people have a hard time holding on to that, not because of a lack of capacity internally, but because the forces of these pulls to identify, of identitarian sort of seduction, of empire, of socialization, of fear, whatever the case is, despair, are really significant. They're incredibly significant. And they're significant in the context of the United States, and they're significant in context of our region. They're significant in Lebanon. They're significant in Palestine. They're significant on purpose, right? So I think the more we can keep, and it might feel like repetition. I've written about this before. Is like repetition is needed. The repetition, the rate at which the state repeats its violence, we have to respond with even more repetition to a counter force to that, to remain focused on why and what our cause is and who we fight for and what our wajib, our duty is. The duty is, like you said, to those babies. The duty is to those women. The duty is to those men, right? We're always, and yes, of course, I can't even put into words what it feels like to watch every single day futures being disappeared. And also the people who are fighting for the liberation of Palestine are also our focus, right? Because they're being martyred under that force, but with a focus on what their liberation project is.
Absolutely. I had to share this. Apologies to people, but like this tweet, talk about tweets that break you, right? One of the doctors once explained that the reason most killed are between 6 and 12-year-olds is because they run less fast than older kids, but are also too big for an adult to carry while running, right? And I think like that is just devastating, but you can also like through this you can understand that reality, right? Of like, I mean, I have a kid in that age range, right? He's tough to carry now, but also if he had to run by himself, like that would be a problem, and like the level of futures, I mean, the number of children that are starving every day now, and that is not, as other people have pointed out, and Sudan, Congo, absolutely. Like this is not a conflict that I'm not even saying that. It's not a genocide that happens in isolation, from the way that the world system
No,
functions. We
no.
understand that totally.
And to think about a logic, this is why I get upset about, and why talking is about also disseminating a precise discourse that helps us continue to keep our focus on things and recognize the structural pressures that are at play so that we can divest from them and build a world otherwise. But also to say this language about there is nothing senseless in an occupying force that targets kids and understands that between 6 and 12, these are the outcomes. There is nothing senseless about an occupying force that arms what we're seeing right now, that arms gangs to raid and loot what's left over from food and then bomb anybody who's intervening around this. And that's, I think, part of the in vivo practice that we're doing is, what does it mean for us to divest from this? For nothing can be, this is the place we're in, nothing can be reckless. We cannot be reckless with anything. We can't be reckless with our language. We can't be reckless with our actions. We can't be reckless with our analysis. We can't be reckless in terms of who we keep company with. There is no room for recklessness around this, because the precision, there is no senselessness. There's precision on the side of state violence. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to practice publicly, together, in private, through action, through direct action, whatever is available to us, about how to do that on our end.
All right, so let's talk about a couple of other related things. Folks, if you have questions in the chat, feel free to drop them in there. Put a Q in front of it so that I can try to see it, because there's a lot of folks in the chat, and appreciate all of your comments and conversation questions and so on. So one of the things we were going to talk about before this was just also like sectarianism in this moment. And I mean, some political sectarianism, also kind of like national or religious sectarianism, like these are long-standing weapons that, I mean, folks read counterinsurgency manuals, like they sit and they think about all of the different ways that societies are divided up or movements are divided up, and how do we pit them against each other and play on these things. And that doesn't mean that there aren't real disagreements that people don't feel because of that very reality, that people are dying on levels that they just cannot even process, that takes a toll on all of us psychologically, and is easy to fall into blame games. It's easy to you know because I believe that the X or Y tactic is the right one to take, that I'm going to go after people for doing something wrong. And this is also something that was, I think, at play with this action as well, is that people are at a deep state of frustration, of exhaustion, of fatigue. They are feeling, I think, even more I don't want to use the word impotent, but that's the one that I can't keep get around saying. I can't think of a good synonym for it. They are feeling like futility, I guess, in the forms of action that they are taking, and so on. And look, it's very hard to know what will be the things. It's not, there's also a mythology, I think, that people have, even about like the Vietnam War, that like the anti-war movement was so strong in the United States that this is the thing that ended the genocide, like, or it was a genocide, but the genocidal war in Vietnam. And it's just not, it's never that simple. And it always is going to include, I mean, the armed resistance in Palestine is still conducting operations whenever the IDF rolls into spaces where they can conduct those operations. There's still the pressure of the aerial blockade, as well as the blockade of the port of Haifa now, along with the Red Sea that Yemen is seeking to impose. There is the changing, slower than we would like, but I think pressure that countries in the EU in particular are feeling around this moment, and needing to, a lot of it is rhetorical distancing, and I don't think we should overestimate the importance of that, because it's not that important ultimately. But I do think that they're doing the rhetorical distancing because they feel pressure to take material steps, and they're hoping that if they do the rhetorical thing, that this will prevent them from having to take the material steps, right? And all of that is to say that it is an important time, I think, to keep the pressure up, to stay focused, and not to give in to despair, and not to let that despair lead us to places where we start turning against each other.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, so that's all I would say.
Well, I think this is part of what Frank was saying on Mechanic Intifada, right? It's just like, this is number one, this is a long fight. Number two, this has been happening for decades. And I think it's not to say that we don't fatigue and we don't do that. For me, it's always been in those moments, what we were calling it a moment of inflection, right? In these moments where they feel more intense. That's not to say that every moment hasn't felt intense, but I think all of us can sort of register moments in which it's felt more intense than others for a variety of reasons, both externally and internally, perhaps. But to say in those moments that becomes the space of responsibility for us to focus even more and understand what is being mobilized through us and by whom, and what does it stabilize and what does it destabilize? What does it neutralize? What does it demobilize? These are the constant questions, because it is a long fight. Any of these things that we see retrospectively and we go, wow, this was a fight that was, right, whether it's like in Algeria or in South Africa or any one of these things, like when you talk to people on the ground there, like our comrades in South Africa are like, this was a fucking long fight. And that's, people talk about as post-apartheid South Africa, but we know the fights that are still being fought in South Africa, partially because much of the population still doesn't have, like, apartheid is not done. Racial apartheid is not done. Many people don't have running water. Like the idea that somehow this is not going to be a perpetual movement. Did you want to say something?
Oh, just Afrikaners need refugee status in the United States because they're oppressed.
Exactly. I mean, this shit is, I think that's part of it. And I do mean it when I say, I think these inflection points are points for us to lean into. What does it mean to build stamina? Right. And that's not at the replacement of us sort of potentially escalating to have moments of real movement to push things forward. But I think there's also something deeply misguided for us to look away from the massive movements that have made. They're not even incremental, the massive movements. Now, those of us who've been sort of politically involved can understand that those massive movements can't happen without decades of organizing, non-sexy organizing prior, where people can seize a moment in a particular way and push it forward in meaningful ways. So, but I do think there's a responsibility for us to look at that and to read, what are the moments in which my stamina actually runs out? What is happening there? This is actually really important psychologically. Part of that, again, I'm saying is external, but part of that might be internal to us. What the moments in which our stamina feels like, I just can't do this anymore. To have that be an analytic in which, like, what is it? What is the tension? What is the contradiction here that feels insurmountable in ways that in other spaces it didn't? And I think that helps us maneuver and sort of not have the forces of oppressions clamp down on our ability not only to imagination is a first step, but also to move forward and enact different things and watch things coming out in emergence. Shit moves quickly. This is the thing we've learned in the last 18 months. It moves really quickly. For us to think that we're going to be able to apply the same sort of forces in the same sort of places is naive, I think. And actually, but us moving also in counterforce, we're seeing also what that demands of the state, and that needs to be what we see as well. Is like, what, like you are making shit happen at the level of the state. Like states don't, the EU doesn't come out and say this shit even rhetorically, right? Without a lot of pressure happening. The Zionist entity is a pariah state, period. There is no going back from this. Zionism, I think, again, this is what Frank's saying, is like, there is no going back from this. What version will emerge from this is something for us to pay attention to and hopefully take the lessons from this moment and keep moving forward. But the version of Zionism that existed prior to Al-Aqsa flood is no longer the Zionism that's here. And we need to understand that. And that is a loss. That is a loss for a settler state whose main focus was legitimacy in a particular way, was to sell itself as a democratic state and hide the fact that ethno-nationalism was at its core. All of that are bygones. And I think those are things for us to keep coming back to that. Again, not as a end point, not for us to sort of be like, okay, we're here. That's not the way it works. This is a long fight. and it's one that was being fought prior to Al-Aqsa flood, and it's one that's going to continue to be fought. Not the least of which is that the climate catastrophe that we are left with, we're already there, but the climate catastrophe of this environmental disaster that the settler state and the imperial state of the United States have caused for all of us, for the world, like, this shit's just starting, folks. And that's where our focus needs to be. But again, this is where rallying around causes. Our causes are liberation. And right now, it's the liberation of Palestine. With the liberation of Palestine, that logic extends itself to the liberation of all liberation from all settler states and against imperial intervention.
I wanted to respond to this because this is actually a myth. So I think there may have been one example of this, but this was a propaganda campaign that the mainstream media waged to suggest it was actually to try to, buttress support for the troops, right? To sort of say, oh, and to turn people against the countercultural, anti-war, all of that move. So this was like a lot of people think that this was something that's widespread because the media really promoted it as this thing that was going on. But it's one of those things that actually, when you dig into the history of it, it's just not anything that was like widespread or generalizable at all. In fact, if you talk to people who were in the Panthers or who were in any of the movements of that era, there was so many people coming home from war that immediately jumped into the anti-war movement or jumped into the Black liberation struggle or so on. And those movements welcomed them because they needed their skills and their know-how, and because they had experienced directly like how, the evils of US imperialism as well. And so it's actually, I just wanted to say that it's actually not really the way that it went down. This point, I think, was an important one that someone raised. Is, yeah, it wasn't, I don't think it was just UK, and I'm not sure about ambassadors, but there was a delegation of European emissaries, like whatever the term, I mean, they were diplomats, right? And Arab diplomats as well.
Yeah.
And they were doing a tour in the West Bank. And I mean, according to Israel, they stepped outside of their agreed upon, path that they had to sign off with the state of where we're going to go and do. And they got mistaken for Palestinians, is what the Israelis are saying. Whether that's true or not,
I mean, which tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah,
If
exactly.
you're a Palestinian, you would have been murdered.
Exactly. Yeah. But yes, I mean, it is quite ironic that, there's, and this is the thing. I mean, it's like on a day when, I don't know, 100 Palestinians plus, I'm sure, were killed,
Yes.
the day, and everybody is talking about these two Israeli, delegates, diplomats, however people want to frame them, state actors, that this becomes the focus, and it becomes, I mean, Netanyahu gave this speech where he connected it to this whole, like, he said, "Free Palestine is the new Heil Hitler." This is what he said in that speech,
They've been trying
and
that shit for ages.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like,
yeah,
that is, look, some people are going to be convinced by that, and some people are going to fall into that line of thinking. But to think that the majority of the world is going to buy that and going to, it, like as Frank said, like, this is not a political ideology that people are going to continue to support, and so people need to be very clear about that and to choose their sides accordingly.
Mhm.
Also, this comment, the beeper attacks and the way that was portrayed in the US media and US officials. I mean, yeah, my shitbag senator Fetterman loves to make jokes about this still to people. And
But
yeah, I mean, go ahead.
can we is so important, because I think very early on, you and I were talking about this, is like, this is a psychological warfare. It's not just psychological warfare, it's propaganda. It's Hasbara, and has been around for ages, but it's also state propaganda, where even in the context of Gaza, you are meant, through the dissemination of this propaganda and through an entire media class, which is what we're seeing right now, right? Entire media class sort of propagate a directive for us to be conscripted into seeing whether it's these people as state actors or the occupation soldiers as their singular human form. In fact, Elias, I think, said that in the manifesto, right? It was sort of like, these people could be good people on an individual basis, but we are exclusively invited into seeing them without their without their uniforms, without their tanks, without their diplomatic cover, without their what they are doing in terms of propaganda for a state that's committing genocide right now, which was actually, the woman was involved in sort of media and propaganda and setting up visits, right, to the embassy and all these sorts of things. So these are like but we are invited, conscripted into forgetting all of that and looking for the kernel of the human that's not the state actor behind this. Whereas in terms of the beepers, we are meant to believe that everybody that was within shot of these beepers was fundamentally a terrorist or connected to that, and therefore a future threat, including the children whose faces were blown off, or who were murdered, or the people who will live with these scars for the rest of their lives, that will mark them as that in the eyes of everybody who believes into it. So there's also something more that there. That's what I mean about the psychological identifications. There's something larger happening here. And that is, for us, that's what I mean in these moments when we're pulled into it. It is not to have forces of oppression strip you of your humanity. It's to understand how that is mobilized in particular directions and in an identification with certain people over others, and who gets to lay claim to who gets to lay claim to innocence and who doesn't. And that happens in a patterned way. This isn't by accident, right? That's what I mean about the racism of it. But racism is not just about, it's about also the forces of the state that can come together to lay claim to a particular narrative, again, in a media class. That's why we have no coverage of 14,000 babies that are going to die of starvation in Gaza, or that perhaps have already died.
Yeah, I mean, and somebody, it was Z Squirrel actually who posted this, but you know, there's a video of Chomsky talking about the war on terror, and you know, he makes the point of like, if you just applied the Western, you just generalized the Western view of like legitimate targets, right? Like, I mean, that's the thing, is this becomes so hypocritical so quickly.
Yeah.
Of within the West, we are given literal justifications at this point. Like, we have lost the ability, not the ability, but hospitals are, you know, like, now under international law, you really don't even see people, except for a few, like, you know, organized healthcare workers and stuff like this, that are actually raising up like, hey, it is a violation of international law to attack a hospital. It's happening every single day, you know, and it has been for, you know, 19 months, I guess. And, you know, then on top of that, like schools, there are no schools left in Gaza. Like, not, you know, I mean, there are schools that people have made, you know, there's like, you know, but there's nothing, there is no refuge, there is no space. You know, they say they want to move people into humanitarian zones, they attack the humanitarian zones. Like, there's nothing, literally. And that it has annihilated all of this sort of discussion about legitimacy of targeting and so on. But,
Mhm.
I mean, how routinely throughout this have we been like, where were the alarm bells about assassination of political leaders? Where are the, like all of this, right? Like it's this is gone. And so now, as people are saying, like, we're invited to view these two people as civilians, to talk about what they were going to do within their personal lives, with the family that they imagine, all these kind of things, right? This is how Western media narrates this.
Mhm.
They have not narrated anything about the destruction of Palestinian futures that has happened en masse,
Mm.
or about, you know, Lebanon and, Yemen and, on and on, right? Syria,
Mhm.
Iran. I mean, there's so many different, you go back to Iraq and Afghanistan and all of that. I mean, so our whole apparatus in terms of media, of like having conversation around this, is like so distorted
Yeah.
and, you know propagandized and turned into psychological warfare weapons, really.
Yeah.
um so yeah,
Because it's an arm of the state,
it
and the
is.
state
Yeah.
functions on propaganda that will stabilize its power to continue enacting violence in the name of imperialism and protecting its own futures. And I think that has to be our starting point. So anytime we're pulled in, again, we'll go back to this as repetitiously as it needs to happen. When we're pulled into these moralizing positions around this, is to remember the function of that. And for me, quite frankly, to throw it the fuck out the second it comes from this media class or coverage, where you're just like, it's enough for us to just be like, this is suspect because this is where it's coming from, right? But then to understand it is not accidental. It is not accidental that that we're seeing the hypocrisy. It's not accidental. And sometimes, like, pointing that stuff out feels, that's what's futile, is pointing that stuff out, because I think then we're moving that somehow, again, I'll say this, that there's a version of this world, of the empire settler colonial project of the United States or the Zionist state, that could do this differently. There isn't a version in which the media is going to give the same amount of attention or narration to the oppressed that it is going to whatever class is going to further its future. And I think the sooner we recognize that, the more we can, you know, channel our energies elsewhere.
Yeah, it's why I don't, when people talk about countries trying to build socialism, or, some kind of, like, and they get all up in arms about, oh, they went after the press. I'm like, of course they did, right? Like, these are the people that they should go after first.
Mhm.
All right. So, and this is true. So Obama, right, did attack. There was a drone strike on Doctors Without Borders, and then Arya said in Kunduz in Afghanistan as well. Yeah, I think it is also important to talk about how the U.S. has fully participated in the shifting of the kind of, and that was the point that Chomsky was making about the war on terror at that point too, was that, like, because he's like, if you apply the same logic, then anyone who works for the federal government is a legitimate target, is basically
Mhm.
what he said. He said, but like, if somebody says that, then they are deemed a crazy person, right? You can't utter those kinds of
Right.
words, right? But he was just making the point. Is like, this is the calculus.
Yeah.
Like, if we just invert it, like, this is what they're actually arguing to us, is that all of these people, all of these state actors, I mean, and we see this quite clearly with how in Gaza, like, everything is Hamas. Like, everything
Yeah.
is, like, it doesn't matter. We can't listen to the medical stuff because it's Hamas. Like, it's
Right.
just all becomes collapsed into, this is all a part, and that is because of what we have allowed in terms of the narration of what it starts to mean when you label things terrorists, and how we have allowed that kind of narration to like just embed itself as a logic that is, it's deep. I mean, it is deeply embedded in people, and even I hear it reproduced. Hell, it was reproduced yesterday, right? Like it was reproduced in terms of like, we actually aren't with this action because it is terrorism,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so it's like, oh, okay, so now you're using terrorism rhetoric, right? Like,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
All right. Free Casey Goonan, absolutely. American embassies are spy and intelligence headquarters around the world. Anyone inside the building is a part of it. This is, yeah. Appreciated this. Actions like this can contribute to tearing down the wall built around our minds, as Basil Al-Araj said. The impunity they enjoy exists only in our minds as well as theirs. I think that's an important point.
And relies on our self-disciplining and policing, right? And believing that those things are structurally sound, that those boundaries are structurally sound. It, it, it,
mm.
it invites all of us to play that disciplining and policing role, which is a version of where, I mean, one thing we haven't said is the condemnation and the moralization is also a form of carceral logic. It's like, you're all fucking cops.
Do you have anything else? I'm trying to think if there was anything else that we wanted to get to. I mean, I guess just reminding people, I mean, again, the Samir Project link is in the show description. I think it is really important. I mean, I have people, I think we all do, who reach out every day from Gaza, and if it was meaningless, they wouldn't be asking people to continue to donate, and so I think it's really important to continue to do that. And the prices just keep going up and up, but yeah, I mean, I also just want people to not dip into the futility of thinking that what they are doing, whatever it is, that it's meaningless. Like it's not, I mean, I think all of us, I said this, I think on October 10th, 9th, I don't know, right after October 7th, but I was very emotional and in my feelings and stuff like that. But I knew that this would be a period where we'll all look back, and we'll all have to reckon with ourselves in terms of what we did and what we didn't do,
Yes.
and
Yes.
like I think we will all have feelings. Well, I still believe that we can win, and so like there's a part of me that says like, hopefully we can look back with pride at that whatever those contributions were. Um, but that's certainly not a certainty, and there are no certainties, and I think that you know you don't want to look back with a lot of regret for not doing things, but I also just think you don't want to allow feeling like what you are doing, if you are doing anything at all, that it is meaningless, and so you're just going to stop doing it. Just keep doing what you're doing, and try to get together with other people and figure out what more you can do, and tap into the things that are going on. I saw Palestinian Youth Movement put out a thing um yesterday, or the other day, a campaign that's just like a kind of trying to build pull together a mass movement just around basic demands and stuff like that. And so yeah, just continue to watch what organizations are doing and ways that you can support them, as well as figuring out ways that you can do things yourself. I don't know if you have any other things you want to say with that.
Well, I'm saying, I'm just like, this is all part of a larger spectrum, and one of this, to be honest about where in the spectrum you're at. We're not saying that we're doing everything on that spectrum, but for you to sort of tap out and not recognize that there is a space for you on one point mark of that spectrum is part of what we're talking about, is to assess and see what is viable for you on that spectrum. It's necessary. I just want to shout out to all the students. And that's the thing, is like, anybody who's saying that somehow what's happening in the United States has no bearing on what's happening in the world, Just one example from my, the place where I got my degree from, and my former employer, the speaker, who I got to talk a little bit to after the Zionists sort of came after her speech. But it is just to remember that all of these are disruptions that are necessary, and it's the only ethical thing. And the reason why I'm bringing her up is because I was on a plane and I had not yet seen that, but a comrade from Palestine sent me that and said, right on, this is what we're looking at. So I want folks to remember this and to support all the various things. And that's why I'm saying shout out to the students who are not letting their schools, all these schools came down with all these different, rules of behavior and what you're allowed to wear and what you're not allowed to wear, and all the creativity that went into, guess what, we're fucking making our noise anyway, and we're going to disrupt. And if nothing else, we're going to make sure that this graduation can't be enjoyed. Like, if that's disruption, is the point, is not to let things settle. And that, if that's your place on the spectrum, fantastic, because people don't get to just have a graduation when there are no schools left in Gaza. People don't just get to, come up as a white woman trying to wash her conscience in the Colombia acting president and say, I understand what your frustration. No, you don't fucking understand the frustration. Fuck you. Get off the stage. Like, those things are actually worth something, because those fuckers go home and they're angry. They're angry about it. Cecilia is not allowed to go on GW campus. She got her degree back in December. She's not allowed back on campus because all she said was, I'm ashamed that my tuition is being used to fund genocide. And that's what I want us to remember. The force with which institutions are coming down on people for saying the most basic shit should be an indication to us about what is needed. And that's your place in the spectrum. And that's how we remain focused on Palestine. Again, they're the ones telling us.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And to, interestingly too, and I wish I had, I'm still digesting it, because I spent, shout out to Renee Johnston, Saturdays with Renee and Jared Ball. But we did an episode a couple of weeks ago, and we read 600 pages of Harvard reports.
Yep.
And the 400 pages of the anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias, that's what it's called. And 200 pages of the anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian bias reports. Don't encourage anyone to read them, but there's interesting things in them that I'm still, thinking about. And within the anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias report, what is very clear is how frustrated Zionists are that their political ideology is under attack, and that they do not feel comfortable in a lot of spaces right now because of their politics, right? But there is this conflation. There's a lot of conflation going on in the report between what's anti-Semitic. I mean, the report, it's very interesting the way they crafted it specifically around anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias. So that, and they also are clear in the report that a larger percentage of Jewish students at Harvard are Israeli or have family members in Israel, or have close ties to Israel. I think those are the three terms that they said, than ever before in the school's history, right? And so they are very acknowledging of that, and they treat discrimination. It's not discrimination. They treat a social context which Israelis feel uncomfortable in as a form of discrimination on a national basis, is like kind of how they're able to like work through it and thread it together. And it's just, but it's very interesting, because a lot of what it comes down to is that the students felt that they were being that they had to prove their political, they had to denounce Zionism basically in order to be welcomed into social spaces, right? And like that's a pretty interesting dynamic. I'm not going to get like too deep into it here, but I think it speaks to, again, like there is this level. We see the, Jerry Seinfeld like cackling maniacally at people like challenging him on the street and stuff like that. Like that's the public face that you see sometimes from folks who are supporting the Zionist entity. But like I, a report like this does reveal that, like, privately, that it is having an impact, and
Yes.
that, if you go over to the other report, the anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian bias report, their first the first thing that they figured out in terms of what needs to be done is that there needs to be divestment. Like, so like, look, our students have been traumatized, their family members have been killed, nobody in the school cares. We're continuing to, and like this is not a report done by the Palestine movement. It's
Right.
a report done by administrators and some faculty, and probably some outside support, whatever. And it says, like, in order for things to be okay, the university is actually going to have to make steps to remove its relationship with what is going on, because without doing that, like, things, people are not going to be okay,
Mhm.
and I think that it's interesting because it's, the whole framework of these reports, I disagree with all of this, but like you can see within it a diagnosis of issues, and in one side they're trying to really obfuscate of course, that the logical step, which is that the problem is the complicity of this institution with what is going on. This is what people are organizing around. And this is what is causing the friction, you know. Anyway, there's
Well,
just an
one side
interesting
is,
thing.
it's interesting because it's a parallel to the larger process. One side says material divestment and dismantling actually fixes it. The other side is genocidal and says if you just disappear Palestine, we'll feel okay. It's the same shit, you know? But you got your directives, folks. People
Yeah.
should be pushed on their politics.
Yeah. All right. Anything else?
Not at all. Always a
All
pleasure.
right. All right. Thank you. This was great. Much appreciated. It was good to do it before too long went past. I'm sure we'll do another one. Since you're back in the States, we can do them maybe
Yeah,
more often. We'll see.
exactly.
Um, all
Thanks,
right,
everyone.
Lara. Thank you so much.